remove the wheel, use a 21mm socket. If you have a locking lug nut, you want to take that off before on the ground by hand, and take the other lug nuts off. Remove the wheel. Now we're going to take the caliper bolts off. Use a 14mm wrench and take the bolts off. And if you need to, you can use a pair of pliers or another wrench on the stud or the slide pin to prevent it from spinning. Take those out. You can take a straight blade screwdriver and just pry the caliper over a little bit and slide the caliper off. And use a brake caliper hanger and just hang it from the coil spring. Just make sure there's no tension on the brake hose. Take the brake pads off. Now we want to take the caliper bracket out. Take these two bolts out, use a 17mm socket. And slide the bracket off. Now you want to take the rotor off. If it doesn't slide off, you can take a hammer, give it a couple taps in that area. Just try not to hit the studs. If it doesn't loosen up with that, you can take a bolt, find one that fits the same pitch of this thread. And tighten it down. And then just go back and forth. There you go. Slide the rotor off. Now we're going to take this axle nut off. It's peened over a little bit right there, so just take a punch and just get underneath there. Just try to bend it back. That should be good. Take a 32mm socket, take the nut off. Just make sure the axle is loose from the hub. You can take that same punch. Just make sure it's loose. That should be good. You just don't want to hammer it too hard, just right on the face of the axle. Now we'll take this cotter pin out right here for the tie rod. Just use some pliers or some type of side cutters. So sometimes cotter pins just don't work out the way you want them to. You're just going to have to break off one of the ends, just like that. And then you can try drilling it out if that works for you, or sometimes just putting a socket on and zinging it off will work as well. Use a 17mm socket, take this nut off. Before we pop the tie rod out, we're going to loosen up the jam nut. Use a 7/8 wrench or a 22mm wrench. Loosen that up. You can try to loosen up the tie rod from the knuckle by hammering right on this part of the knuckle. It's just not that safe. You could damage the knuckle, and if you hammer it from underneath there, you could damage the threads. So if you use a tool like this, you won't damage the boot or the threads. And just tighten this up. And it'll just pop like that. And take the wheel speed sensor off. Use a 10mm socket. And pull this off. And slide the sensor out. And this clip is going to come off, just so you can slide that out of the way. Now we're going to take the strut bolts and nuts off. Use a 7/8 wrench or a 22 and a 22mm socket. Take these off. And slide that out. You can separate this from the strut. Now you could separate the ball joint right there, but it's a lot easier if you separate it from underneath. So we're going to use a 17mm socket and take these two nuts off and this bolt. When you get the last one, just support the knuckle. And then slide this out. Slide the axle out. And you can slide this up. It comes right out. Now you're going to have to set it up in some type of press because we have to press out the center hub right there. So find something that's going to fit in there, whether it's a socket, and then you're going to have to press it out. And there's the hub. There's one of the races from the bearing on the inside. So just try to get underneath here, and then if you have a hook tool like this, you can get under there. It's just a dust shield. Take that off. Now we're going to use some snap ring pliers and just take out the snap ring. It might be rusted in there a little bit. If it's stuck in there, just take a screwdriver and just a hammer, just give it a little tap. Here we go. Slide it out. You can line this up right here. Find the right cup that fits. There we go. All the way out. And there's the race. And there was ball bearings in here. We took those out earlier, but that's what you want. You want the race to come down. So you want something that's going to push on the inside of there and push it through into something. So that worked. And then you flip the knuckle over, and the new bearing is going to go in this way. Just line that up. And sometimes it's easiest to just use the race because it fits right, to the new bearing. Send it on just like that. And pretty much install this until it pretty much stops, and then it should be at the end point. And that comes out. Double check this side, just make sure there's no gap, and that looks really good right there. And take the snap ring and use your pliers and just line it up. Make sure it goes all the way down. That looks good. If it doesn't go all the way down, the bearing's probably not installed all the way. Now I want to flip it over again, and I'm going to use the old inboard side of the race and put that on the inside here because we don't want the center of the bearing to push out. So you want that being supported, and you might need a little adapter there. Just like that. It's all lined up. And that's all the way down. Now I'll line this dust shield up. There's a hole, line that up with the hole for the wheel speed sensor. Just give it a tap back in. And line this up. Put the axle in and line the ball joint up. Get the nuts started. And get the bolts started. And snug these down. And slide this in position. And get the bolts started. And put the nuts on. Put the tie rod back in position, and the castle nut. Now that this is all back together, it's easier to torque these bolts, and we're going to torque the lower ball joint first to 94 foot-pounds. and the two nuts. Now the lower strut bolts to 155 foot-pounds. And the tie rod to 36 foot-pounds. And slide a cotter pin in. Make sure you replace it with a new one. If the hole doesn't line up, you can tighten the nut a little bit more until the hole lines up. And take some side cutters and just bend it, and then trim off the rest. And put the new axle nut on. You're going to need a 30 12-point socket, 30 millimeters. I'm installing the pry bar right here into the hub to prevent it from spinning, and then I'm going to torque the axle nut to 217 foot-pounds. And just take a punch or a chisel and a hammer and just give it a tap. Just peen over the axle nut. It's just going to prevent it from loosening up. So that looks good right there. Now reinstall the wheel speed sensor. Just line the bracket up. It's going to go right there. And the wheel speed sensor in the hole. Put the bolt in. And snug it up with a 10 millimeter socket. You can use a lug nut to hold this on. It just makes installing it a little bit easier. Now slide the bracket over the rotor, put the bolts in, get them started. Torque these two bolts to 79 foot-pounds. Now install the brake pads, and you want that at the top side so the rotor cuts into that. So do that on the outside and on the inside. Take the brake caliper off the hanger. And you want to compress the brake caliper piston. You can use a brake caliper compressing tool and go nice and slow. As you compress the caliper piston, it's pushing fluid through the brake hoses, through the lines, back up into the master cylinder reservoir. Just go nice and slow. Now make sure the hose isn't twisted and slide this over the brake pads. Take the bolts, get those started. Now I'm going to hold the pin from spinning just with some pliers. If you have a wrench that fits, you can use that too. And torque this bolt to 25 foot-pounds. Same with the upper one. At this point, you can take this lug nut off. Put the wheel up. And put the lug nuts on. Now torque the lug nuts to 77 foot-pounds in a cross pattern to tighten the wheel down evenly. Just go around again, double check. Now make sure you pump the brake pedal nice and slow. It may go to the floor. And once it feels good, that feels pretty good. And double check the fluid level under the hood and adjust accordingly. After you've done this job, make sure you bring the vehicle to a local shop to have it aligned. You don't want to have premature tire wear.